When it emerged this week that U.S. health regulators are suggesting that the U.S. federal government loosen restrictions on cannabis, the news put the cannabis market into a frenzy. This came when the Health and Human Services Department recommended removing cannabis from a category of drugs deemed to have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The agency advised moving pot from that Scheduled 1 group to the less tightly regulated Schedule 3. The decision is ultimately up to the Drug Enforcement Administration. Joining us now to help explain what this potential rescheduling could mean for cannabis in the U.S. is Yael, Ossowski, Deputy Director at the Consumer Choice Center. Yael, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you elaborate on the difference between a Schedule 1 drug and a Schedule 3 drug?
Yeah, it's an important distinction, mainly because we're talking about putting people in prison. We're talking about laws. We're talking about big police budgets. Essentially, when you have a Schedule 1 drug, this is the most serious of categories. This means that there are no medical uses, and there's an incredibly high ability for that said drug to addict people who use it. And if we look at Schedule 3, there are accepted medical uses and a lower risk of addiction. And that's really what makes the difference between cannabis as Schedule 1 and perhaps this change that could bring it down to Schedule 3. It would bring in a whole host of changes that I think many of us celebrate. But again, it's long past time that we get this done.
Now, for Canadians, where cannabis has been legal recreationally for 5 years and legal medicinally for much longer, can it be difficult to understand why cannabis was ever listed as a Schedule 1 drug? Why was cannabis scheduled in such a way, and why has it taken the federal government so long to reevaluate this?
It's been a long journey, and realistically, you had the first laws on cannabis and other drugs beginning in the early 1900s in the United States. You had a lot of immigrant populations that were bringing in various plants that we did not have in the United States before. And it was really in 1970, with the passing of the Controlled Substances Act and signed by Richard Nixon, that it really came into force. And at that point, you had a huge bureaucracy that was now dedicated to trying to fight drug abuse and the global war on drugs. Notably, though, cannabis was in that highest category of Schedule 1. There's a lot of reasons that we can probably point to. Obviously, the medical research was not as well documented as we have today, but also probably a huge grudge of President Richard Nixon at the time. He had a lot of grudges against the anti-war left, the hippie generation. There's a lot of that was kind of a part of it. But really, for years and years, there were all kinds of professionals making the case that cannabis should not be in Schedule 1 because there are documented medical uses. There have been attempts to reform this. There have been attempts through all kinds of physician societies. There have been various government departments, but still nothing has changed. You really have only had small tinkering, and that's left states to go around and try to legalize in their own way, but still not allowing that federal controlled substances categorization to change.
So if the DEA chooses to move cannabis to a Schedule 3, some have argued that this is the beginning of the end of federal cannabis prohibition. Do you agree with that statement?
I think it's just a beginning. I would not tell our Canadian cannabis friends in the stock market to go off to the bank just yet. What it would mean, though, is that it would allow for at least research. And that's an important categorization that we need just to understand what it means to have cannabis legalized. And it also would allow those legitimate businesses that exist in, the 23 states where cannabis is legal. They're actually going to be able to run a legitimate business. They're going to be able to put down their business expenses, just as those business expenses of the construction worker or someone who has their own small business. They're going to actually be able to participate in the economy. They're still not going to be able to use banks and to get loans, but they still are going to be able to at least use parts of the tax code to help them out. That's a very good move for the very growing and nascent cannabis industry in the United States, and actually could prove dividends for Canada in the future. But again, it's just a very, very small step, and it's likely a process that's going to take about 2 or 3 years before we actually see this happen.
So we have about 30 seconds. What can the U.S. learn from Canada in regards to cannabis legalization?
Oh boy, there's a lot to go off there. Canada obviously had it right in legalizing, wrong in giving a monopoly to various provincial governments, to giving more of a role for governments to run it, having government stores. We need free competition. We need to be able to cut away all of the red tape, allow this to be a normal product, which is it is. It's just like caffeine. It's just like nicotine. It's a drug that should be controlled in some way, but allow legitimate entrepreneurs to provide them to customers. Otherwise, in Canada, we have a growing illegal market that's still there. We can avoid that in the United States, but only time will tell if they'll actually take that advice.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.